House File 768, Vice Chair Hudson has this bill, and welcome to the testifiers table. Representative Hudson, would you like to move your bill?
That is my motion, Madam Chair.
Very good. House File 768 is before us. I understand there is a technical amendment to your bill. Representative Hudson.
That is correct, Madam Chair. Thank you. The A4 amendment is an author's amendment that is intended to put the bill in the form that I intended. It deletes the new language proposed in page 3, line 2.
Very good. Any discussion to the amendment? Seeing none, all members in favor of adopting the amendment, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. The amendment is adopted. To your bill, Representative Hudson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Today, I'm here to present a critical piece of legislation that reinforces our constitutional rights, prevents government overreach, and maintains fair and effective anti-discrimination efforts. HF768 is designed to uphold protected speech by safeguarding individuals' rights to freely express their own opinions without fear of government monitoring. The First Amendment is a cornerstone of our constitutional republic and essential to our democratic process. This bill reaffirms that protected speech cannot be monitored or tracked by the government. Free speech is a fundamental right, even if it may find certain views, or some people may find certain views, controversial or offensive. This bill ensures that individuals can express dissent, discuss sensitive topics, and engage in healthy debate without fear of being added to a database. Allowing a government entity to maintain a database on protected, perceived offensive speech creates a chilling effect and discourages open debate and discussion. Further, the United States Supreme Court has repeatedly upheld that the government cannot regulate or track speech simply because it is unpopular. Other states have faced legal challenges when agencies overstepped constitutional boundaries by monitoring speech. This bill ensures that the government does not infringe upon free expression while continuing to enforce anti-discrimination laws. What this bill does not do is prevent the Department of Human Rights from investigating legitimate discrimination. It simply ensures that speech itself, no matter how controversial, is not tracked in a government database. If speech crosses into harassment, threats, or illegal discrimination, existing law already provides a way to address it. This bill does not change or weaken those protections. Protecting free speech and combating discrimination are not mutually exclusive. Both can be upheld in a fair and lawful manner. That is my bill, Madam Chair, and I believe there is one testifier.
If you are here to testify, please come forward, state your name for the record, and proceed with your testimony.
Good morning, Madam Chair and members of the committee. My name is Rayanna Lee. I'm the Legislative and Coalitions Director for the Americans for Prosperity chapter here in Minnesota. AFP is dedicated to protecting and preserving the First Amendment and stopping threats to free speech. The First Amendment is the cornerstone of a free society, and it ensures that every American has the power to think, speak, and act as they see fit, as long as they do not violate the rights of others. Yet we continue to see increasing efforts to suppress free expression through government oversight and monitoring. House File 768 pushes back against this overreach by barring the Minnesota Department of Human Rights from creating or maintaining a database that tracks constitutionally protected speech. We have seen past attempts to establish government-run databases to monitor so-called bias incidents. While addressing real threats and unlawful conduct is incredibly important, these databases repeatedly go beyond their intended purposes, and they capture lawful speech, fostering a climate of fear. No Minnesotan should have to worry that their words, whether in a debate, a classroom, or a simple conversation, might be cataloged by the state. When the government agencies track free speech, even with good intentions, they chill chill open, legal, and protected discourse. People begin to self-censor and they avoid difficult but necessary conversations. And when speech is suppressed, so is progress. We know that throughout history, societal change has come from open discussion and the ability to challenge prevailing ideas and the courage to speak freely without government reprisal. As the legislative director speaking on behalf of AFP's positions, or just even as an independent citizen with opinions and ideas, you may not like what I have to say, and we may disagree on an issue or how to come forward to a solution, and that is okay. That is part of the free marketplace of ideas. But I will always stand up to protect everybody else's right to free speech. We become in dangerous waters. We get into dangerous waters when we weaponize government to suppress things we just don't like or disagree with. We thank Representative Hudson for bringing this bill forward, and this ensures that Minnesota remains a state where free speech is not only protected but encouraged. We urge your support for this bill, and please stand on the side of protecting free speech. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Is there anyone in the audience wishing to testify in favor of or with concerns for this bill? Okay, member questions. Thank you for your testimony. Representative Finke.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Representative Hudson, for your bill. This is another bill that I really do understand and basically support the idea that's being here, if I understand correctly. I did work on potentially bringing an amendment to find a middle way here, because I do think there's something that we could work here. We didn't have time, and I wasn't quite sure how to do it. But I think that what I'm really interested in preserving is, above your addition, there is this, the idea of the Minnesota Department of Human Rights putting forward a report each biennium that recommends policy and system changes to prevent further civil rights incidents across Minnesota. I'm very interested in that being a report that the Minnesota Department of Human Rights produces. I'm very interested in trends regarding threats of violence, trends regarding what kind of speech is and is not increasing, right? So we could say that there is protected speech, for example, of an anti-Semitic nature that should not be perhaps personally recorded in a database, but that information makes its way to the Department of Human Rights, because if this is something that is happening, or Islamophobia, or any marginalized, targeted historical group that is protected by that department, I would like us to be able to have a report that says, hey, this is on the rise. This is something maybe that lawmakers should be aware of. However, de-identified data perhaps would be a solution. I think that there's ways to have a conversation about this, because I do think that protecting the right of, protecting free speech, protecting the First Amendment, protected speech, it's a real concern. And for all of the things that people may or may not think about what we disagree on, what you haven't found me introduce is a bill that penalizes someone for using the language that they use. That's not something that I do. I want us all to treat everyone with humanity and dignity, because it is the values that we share. It is not about making illegal the speech that people use. And I think that this kind of there is a way for us to figure out how to do both of those things, because speech can accumulate in a way. It bioaccumulates, if you will, like a toxin in the bloodstream. And before you know it, if you're not watching it, you may find yourself in a situation you would have liked to have known was forthcoming. So I'll just end by saying I have been concerned about a couple of the bills that we've heard in the way that they expand responsibility, including legal culpability for actions regarding protest in public. And the thing that most energizes me to see is the protection of our right to assemble and our right to organize. I believe that is extremely under threat in this country, and regardless of what you're organizing on behalf of, we need to protect that right to assemble. So That was a lot, but I just want to say that I do think that we're working in important grounds here. And when I look forward at where this country is going, measuring this out is going to be absolutely essential. So I think that people who maybe are on the different sides of the speech coin should really be having conversations like this to figure out how we're all going to coexist as we really see speech being, I mean, frankly, just criminalized by executive order. And I think that we need to address this very seriously. So thank you for your work. I really would be interested in working on this together.
Vice Chair Hudson, any comments?
Absolutely. Thank you, Madam Chair. And indeed, Representative Finke, you offer a lot that's worthy of chewing on and digesting and discussing. I will start by pointing out that this bill is being laid over. So there's plenty of time. I understand the amendment. I ran into some time considerations myself that graciously were accommodated by your side in terms of getting the author's amendment in. But there is plenty of time to work on this bill, and I'm happy to discuss your ideas and potentially look at altering language in whatever manner seems appropriate. What I will speak to, however, is so this idea that that the Department of Human Rights, in order to do its work of legitimately protecting folks from discrimination, that there needs to be some degree of monitoring of speech, of trends in thought, I think is a way to fairly characterize it, where we're going to try to detect through some mechanism what people are thinking, what people are saying, where the trend lines are on different ideas, and somehow coalesce that into meaningful data that can inform legislating, I think is a pretty dubious prospect. And this comes back, this bill is a response to a bill in the previous biennium, the previous term. It was HF181 that I had the opportunity to be on public safety when it was heard multiple occasions. And that bill was going to authorize the Department of Human Rights to solicit, receive, and compile reports of bias incidents, including non-criminal acts. And we discussed this thoroughly in public safety and on the floor. I believe there was probably over an hour-long debate on the topic on the House floor last term. And many examples were offered of the types of incidents that potentially would qualify as being documented in this database that was the objective of HF 181. And there were things such as, somebody standing on a street corner and somebody drives by and yells an insult at them. That's going to be reported to the Department of Human Rights. Okay. How do you verify that actually happened? And time again, when we had these back and forths, whether it was in committee or on the House floor, the answer again and again was, well, what matters at the end of the day is how the person receiving the message felt about that message. If they felt that it was biased, motivated by bias, if they felt as though they were somehow being discriminated against, then it qualifies as something that should be documented as this trend of thought that we're going to monitor in order to inform future legislative action. I think it's fairly obvious that the quality of such data would be all but useless. It's entirely arbitrary. It's completely subjective. You're saying we're just going to accept whatever claim somebody offers to the Department of Human Rights, take it on face value, not vet it, not do any sort of analysis of whether or not it, first of all, even actually happened, let alone that it was reported correctly. There's no due process involved in that. And so even if you're using non-identifiable aggregate data, of what value is that aggregate data to actually determining what the real trends of thought are? So even if I were to accept the idea that it's a legitimate governmental exercise for the state to try to monitor trends in thought, which I don't, that mechanism for doing so, I don't think would give you accurate aggregate data. But then again, I think the more fundamental point is the state doesn't have a compelling state interest in tracking what people are thinking and what people are saying. So when we go to things like crime, like actual harassment, actual threats, actual discrimination that requires a civil response, we have existing mechanisms in law to deal with those things. The last thing I'll address, simply because you brought it up, is the the comparison to our efforts to provide vicarious culpability or vicarious liability for folks who are involved in organizing criminal trespass and damage done to critical infrastructure. Those are crimes. And we're not talking about protest. Like if we're going to put forward the premise that the inability to organize, to trespass upon and damage critical infrastructure somehow prohibits people from protesting, I think we need to look at what our definition of protest is. There's a very clear distinction between speech and criminal action.
Thank you, Vice Chair Hudson. Follow-up, Representative Finke.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Representative. Appreciate your perspectives on all of these issues. I would just say that I don't disagree with what you're saying about trends in thought. I would love to perhaps work together on what is an extremely troubling amount of observation and data collection on trends of thought that are being done by our police departments and our law enforcement agencies, who are doing that extensively on people in your social media accounts, across all of the internet data that is being moved around. That there is the notion that there is not data being collected and used by measuring trends of thought by a lot of people, many of whom have a state interest. That's incorrect. So we should do it one way or the other. We either allow police to use that data to help us find criminals. Maybe we can allow our Department of Human Rights to use that data as well. We'll see. Thanks.
Discussion, Vice Chair Hudson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Representative Finke. I must confess I don't know the particulars of what you're talking about regarding your claim that law enforcement is collecting data on trends of thought. Very interested in learning more. Let's have that conversation.
All right, Representative Curran.
Thank you, Chair. And just, I'm trying to figure out, because we do have a lot of bills moving at the same time that will affect each other. And so when we're talking about vicarious liability, would the bill before us today, would that impede the ability to prosecute people for protesting if we're not allowed to collect that data, especially if that data doesn't identify anybody? Because I'm assuming then the goal is to have that data to go after somebody. So does this bill impede the goals of other bills moving through the process?
Vice Chair Hudson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Representative Curran. To my knowledge, the Minnesota Department of Human Rights is not a law enforcement agency. It does not engage in criminal investigations. And so this bill prohibits the Minnesota Department of Human Rights from collecting a database of protected speech. I don't see how that prohibition would in any way impede the ability of law enforcement to engage in legitimate investigations of criminal activity.
Representative Curran.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm curious because a larger part of this conversation and the reason why some of this language landed here, and I'm in agreement with that. This is an area that really needs to be gone through with a fine-tooth comb. This is really sensitive. Free speech is obviously something very important to all of us. But I do think that there's merit in the idea that we're collecting data to identify trends, especially if we're going to try to look at if these trends are also trending with criminal actions, criminal behavior, because what we're seeing is as free speech includes hateful speech, speech that incites violence, we do see those occurrences trend up. And so, when we see government officials who are allowed to speak out against minority communities, we do see violence against those communities increase. We see that as people in society view that as more acceptable. They feel more inclined that they can just say whatever they would like to say and walk away without consequence. But the consequence is still there when we have people who are, by large margins over-abused and, have criminal acts against them. And so, The idea that maybe public safety is not related to human rights, I fundamentally disagree with. I think attacks on human rights start out as speech. It starts out as testing the waters. It starts out as bullying people to see how far you can get. And at some point, that turns into either violence on the streets or violence that we see promoted through bills that have been entered into this legislature.
Vice Chair Hudson, any response?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you once again, Representative Curran. Just to clarify, so my claim is not that the jurisdiction of public safety or the concept of public safety is somehow detached from human rights conceptually. My claim is that the Minnesota Department of Human Rights is not tasked with engaging in criminal investigations, and therefore this particular bill and its prohibition upon a creation of a database that has protected speech as a target for aggregate data would in any way impede a legitimate criminal investigation. I'd also remind us, if you look at the bill, line 315 through 318, in particular, the definition of protected speech, it says it includes any exercise of the right of freedom of speech or of the press, the right to assemble or petition, or the right of association guaranteed by the United States Constitution or the Minnesota Constitution. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about protected speech. We're saying that the Department of Human Rights, in its unique specified capacity to uphold and investigate complaints related to discrimination and other violations of civil rights in this state, that process, whatever processes they have, cannot include collecting data on protected speech. And so when we go back to this idea of we need to somehow correlate trends in criminal activity with trends in thought, trends in expression, trends in protected speech, I think there's an inherent constitutional prohibition upon the state doing that. There's clear lines that we draw where we say we're not going to do, in effect, what I perceive you're talking about. We are not going to look inside people's heads or at expressions that they've made in through whatever medium, social media, talking to people, public comments, and then try to detect through this pre-crime process the likelihood that they're going to engage in something that is a criminal activity. We have a very clear line that's drawn in both the Minnesota and United States Constitutions to prevent exactly that, a firewall protecting speech, free expression, freedom of the press, freedom of association. We're going to maintain that firewall.
Representative Curran, follow up?
Thank you, Chair. Sure. I'm not really sure what else to say about this other than we all know the communication and the attempted, I don't even know what you want to call it, accusations that happen out in the public under the guise of free speech that end up coming to this place and treating some of us like less than, and I'll leave it at that.
Representative Feist.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a few thoughts. I feel like this bill is like a Rorschach blot, if that's how you say it, like where we all look at it and we see like our feelings. But I'd like to go back to the language of the bill. So I have a few thoughts. The first is that what is speech is actually super complicated, whether something is expressive conduct, what is protected speech, what is criminal, what is a threat. I think that's all very complicated. And I think that the Department of Human Rights in their letter sends us on the road to language that will achieve your goals and is workable. And that was language around only aggregate data, no private, confidential, non-investigative data. And so I think there's room to work on this. I generally think it's a solution in search of a problem, but sometimes we make things that are implicit, explicit for a reason, and I respect that. And I think saying that we care about free speech is an important value that maybe we say, even though I don't know that there's an issue here. And so I'd like to go to the report, and I don't know if you've had a chance to look at it, Representative Hudson. It's 19 pages, has a lot of pie charts.
On page 4, there are a couple of footnotes that I think are really relevant here. Footnote 1 says this is not the result of an investigation and determination of an alleged charge of discrimination under Minnesota Statute 363A06 subdivision 1. 8. Therefore, there is no private, confidential, non-investigative data on any individual governed by the Minnesota Government Data Practices Act, Chapter 13, Human Rights Act, collected or included in this report. And then footnote 2 says this report is not about hate speech. Hating, disliking, or having bias against someone or a group of people on its own is not a violation of any civil rights law. Discussions around how and when speech may be regulated, from commercial speech, obscenity, and speech that is used for inciting imminent lawless action, is not a topic of this report. And then, like I said, there's good pie charts. It's really aggregate, high-level data, just looking at, the constellation of issues that House File 181 was intended to address. And I think it's a good report. I also, I was on the board of the ACLU of Minnesota for a while. I'm also a free speech purist. I feel really strongly about it. And I don't have concerns about this report. And the way that House File 181 is being implemented. But like I said, I do see value sometimes in making things implicit, explicit, and I think there's language here that can achieve your goals and the larger goals. Thanks.
Vice Chair Hudson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Representative Feist. Just for clarity, I don't have the report that you're referencing in front of me. Is that the report that is a result of the well, it ended up being Senate File 2909 was the final omnibus bill?
Representative Feist.
Yes, it is.
Vice Chair Hudson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Representative Feist. Thank you so much for this question. So yeah, I looked at the letter submitted from the Department of Human Rights, and I found it really fascinating. Their premise seems to be, 1, we're not doing this. 2, if you prohibit us from doing this, it's going to make it really hard for us to do our job. Which strikes me as a little bit like a kid saying, I am most definitely not taking a cookie out of that jar. But if you put a really tight lid on it, you're really going to ruin my day. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. If they don't need to monitor speech in the way that House File 181 explicitly enabled them to do, then why would explicitly prohibiting them from doing it somehow impede their operations of fulfilling their mandate? And you say this is a solution in search of a problem. I've repeatedly identified what the problem is. The problem is that we have, in the attempt to, well, actually it was ultimately passed in Senate File 2909, this House File 181. It was watered down significantly, but the authority was granted and still exists within the Department of Human Rights to do this. They can do it at any time. They got the money too. It was appropriated. We heard, I believe it was in this committee earlier this session, that they have 90% of that money still retained and that they're not doing this, which is great, but it's a ticking bomb. At any time, they can use that money. They've been authorized in legislation that was passed last year to do this. So the question is, should they do it? And if the answer is no, then we should be advancing this bill to prohibit them from tracking protected speech.
Representative Feist, follow up.
Yep. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for your response. I think the key issue that I am seeing here is just that the question of what is constitutionally protected free speech is incredibly complex and nuanced. I would imagine there'd be a fiscal note of some constitutional professor who'd need to be on call to be well, that's expressive conduct, or that's criminal speech, whatever. So I think that the language that you have here wouldn't work. And to me, I see that as the key issue. In terms of those funds, I think it's up to us, this 20 biennium, to decide what is the best and highest use of those funds. And I do encourage you to look at the report. One of the findings is that restorative practices are a really great way to de-escalate conflict and to ensure accountability and healing for people who've been victimized. And so maybe we want to invest in that.
Vice Chair Hudson, any comment?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Representative Feist. So regarding the complexity of determining what is protected speech, Perhaps from the perspective of a lawyer, which you are and I am not, there is a great deal of complexity there when you get into the nuance of particular situations. As a broad concept, I think we can discern the difference between what is speech and what is criminal action. Indeed, prior to HF181 ever being introduced, the Department of Human Rights was engaged in that. Their mandate is to investigate complaints regarding discrimination and other violations of human rights. So they already have to engage in an assessment of, does this complaint qualify as a legitimate complaint within that mandate? And we heard from the department here in this committee regarding how they go through that process. I think they're well-schooled in how to make that discernment, and I don't think prohibiting them from creating a database of aggregate protected speech, whether it's identifiable or not, is going to impede them from doing what they were doing before.
Thank you. Representative Liebling.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So just something you just said, Representative, is I think I need to push back on a little bit. When you read the Department of Human Rights letter and you say that, you know, there's an inconsistency there, you are making the assumption that your language works to do what you hope it does. And that's exactly the problem. You know, you may not be a lawyer, but you are here writing law. And so words matter, and court cases matter, and all of that backdrop matters. And we have to pay attention to it, because that is how any words that we write will be interpreted in light of that. So just a couple of things about this language that you have here, and I also don't necessarily disagree with your underlying concern and premise. But when you look at this language you've written is incredibly broad. And for example, as I read this, it would prevent the department from collecting police reports that have incidentally protected speech in them. Or, for example, news clippings. You have directly or indirectly. So, you know, that covers a lot of stuff. So I would just say to you that, you know, I really agree with Representative Feist. You know, it's not bad to call out the value, but we have to be mighty careful that you're not, that's why it's stopping the department's work, because it is way too broad and needs a lot more work. But so turning from that, I just want to call out something else here. It's great, you know, we're all very concerned about freedom of speech. I certainly have been, you know, I'm kind of a purist on freedom of speech too. You know, if the Nazis want to march in Skokie, I also think the ACLU was right to, you know, as much as I hate Nazis, and I do hate Nazis, I think they have the right to march in Skokie, which is what the ACLU defended, and I would defend their right to do that because the First Amendment's a very important value. And I just want to call out here that when we're defending free speech, we have to be willing to defend speech we hate. And that's a really important part of this, right? All speech that is protected speech has to be protected, right? And, you know, so I have a real concern, and, you know, I know that your side doesn't like it when we bring up what's happening on the federal level, but we have a president who is suing news organizations for defamation in order to stop them from, not with legislation certainly, but very surely stopping them from criticizing him by suing them for defamation. And I wonder if that's something that you support, or would you call that out as being a real threat to free speech, as I believe that it is?
Vice Chair Hudson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Lead Liebling. It's interesting that you bring up the use of lawsuits to quell free expression. In this body, we passed, I believe it was last term, under your majority, an anti-SLAPP law that was specifically targeted at preventing exactly that from public officials through lawsuit against individuals who they don't like, basically harassing them into silence. This language, the language that you pointed out, is lifted straight from that law when it talks about what protected speech is. Specifically, protected speech includes any exercise of the right of freedom of speech or of the press, the right to assemble or petition, or the right of association guaranteed by the United States Constitution or the Minnesota Constitution. when we talk about the ability of the Department of Human Rights being impeded by this language, what the language says is that the Department of Human Rights shall not, directly or indirectly, here's the key, maintain in any collection or database any incident of protected speech. So we're not talking about incidental collections of, or incidental obtaining of speech as part of a legitimate process to investigate a claim of discrimination. We're talking about maintaining a collection, maintaining a database of what is protected speech for undefined, undisclosed purposes that could be utilized in the future to justify legislation like we have seen throughout the world. So we have in Germany, there's a recent 60 Minutes segment, CBS News piece showcased how German authorities cracked down on online speech deemed harmful or offensive under the country's stringent speech laws. The report documented early morning police raids targeting individuals suspected of posting content that would incite hatred, including insults or even memes. Unless you think, oh, that's just Germany, we don't need to worry about that here. Just on Monday, we had New York Governor Kathy Hochul announce that the state will ramp up surveillance efforts on social media accounts and that law enforcement will take proactive measures, including contacting people on suspicion of using hate speech, using speech, suspicion of using speech. So there's a very real and clear intent. That is, I mean, you want to focus on what's happening in this country? There's clearly an effort to try to weaponize legitimate concerns about discrimination and civil rights violations in order to encroach upon an area that government has no right to encroach upon. And that is our thoughts, our expressions, our beliefs, our sincerely held values. Government has no business collecting that, surveilling that, documenting it, placing it in a database for purposes that it might decide to implement down the road, like what we've seen in New York and Germany.
Madam Chair.
Leadley.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Representative Hudson. Well, your language says the Department of Human Rights shall not directly or indirectly maintain in any collection or database any incident of protected speech. That's really broad language, and I believe that would stop them from collecting news clippings that might incidentally contain protected speech or police reports, for example. So I'm just saying here that this language that you have here, instead of kind of saying to the department, you're wrong, it's ridiculous, you're contradicting yourself, maybe you'd need to like kind of listen to people about what your language is actually doing and tailor it, and I hope you will, because some members here want to work with you. And, you know, if we want to make a strong statement about protecting speech, we maybe can do that, but without stepping on things that are not intended here. So, and I do want to comment on your reference to Germany and all of that. You know, Germany has a particular history, and they do not have the same constitutional protection for speech that we have in this country. But you can see why they have it. I'm not saying we should have it in this country. But the reason they have it is because they have seen in a very real way, and not that long ago, how hate speech becomes death camps. That's the problem. And hate speech in this country can become something similar, notwithstanding that we have protection for it. And we have to guard against that thing happening, and it does concern me that we're not all guarding against that thing happening. So I do think there's a concern when police are monitoring people's speech. And I don't know what you said about Kathy Hochul. I don't know if that comes, I think you said it came from a news report. And as we know, news reports aren't always accurate. And we need to probably go to the source to see if that is what she said. But regardless, that's New York, it's not Minnesota. You know, we need to do our work on this to make sure that we are appropriately protecting speech. But you did not answer my question. And I think it's really important. Do you support the President of the United States suing news organizations because they say things he doesn't like? I mean, I'd really like to know that we really all share these values, of keeping government from especially protect the free press is part of the First Amendment. And yet we have this going on without any concern, apparently, from Republicans. And I hope we can really, no matter where it comes from, we should be calling it out. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Vice Chair Hudson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Lead Liebling. Since we've gone this direction, it's been interesting listening to member commentary from my Democratic colleagues during the presentation of this bill, expressing the sincere desire to affect what it is that I'm trying to accomplish here with my bill. And I've refrained from pointing this out, but since you've decided to turn this into a partisan political show, every single one of you who were serving in the last term voted for this database. Let's not pretend you didn't. You don't get to showboat about how much you love free speech when you brought to the floor and passed, and this governor signed, this ability for the Minnesota Department of Human Rights to track our speech. I shouldn't talk about New York. I shouldn't talk about Germany. How many times have we heard about Trump since this session started? You want to focus? Let's focus on what this bill does. It says the Minnesota Department of Human Rights is not going to maintain a collection or database of protected speech. That shouldn't be controversial. And it shouldn't threaten the ability of any legitimate government agency to do a legitimate governmental job. Now, if you want to work on language that ensures that this is tailored towards my intention of protecting people from being monitored and surveilled in what they think and what they say, while allowing the Minnesota Department of Human Rights to do its job, I'll be more than happy to do that.
Thank you. Representative Ingan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Hard to top that. Representative Liebling, I find it offensive. I find it a form of hate speech. And I object wholeheartedly to your assertion that this bill has language that's objectable. When he's referring to the U.S. Constitution and the Minnesota State Constitution as reasons why the government collecting and maintaining a database for hate speech is somehow okay. But I am so thankful that right now this side of the aisle allows you to say it and doesn't track it. Because as soon as society engages in this back and forth of what is perceived as biased or hurtful, and we use that database to quell and to suppress others from being able to say those sincerely held beliefs, that's when you have violence. That is when society crumbles. And to assert that somehow the language of his bill is what's objectable after having voted to do this, you are not recognizing the fact that the shoe could very, very soon be on the other foot. I implore you guys to vote yes on this bill. I implore you guys to say yes and continue working if there actually is an amendment that you'd like to bring forward. But I've heard two members on that side of the aisle say, of course we value freedom of speech, but. There is no but. The government has no interest in doing this.
We're going to give the bill's author some final words, and then we're going to lay the bill over and move on to Representative Feist's bill. Vice Chair Hudson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll simply conclude. I think we've thoroughly discussed this bill, so there's not much left that I need to say other than to just clarify, or reiterate the positive and productive points, which are there has been an expressed intention to ensure that the object, the intention of this bill is fulfilled. There's been concerns raised about being able to simultaneously somehow affect the spirit of what HF 181 in the last term was trying to accomplish without violating our First Amendment rights. I don't know how we do that, but it's a conversation that's worth having, and I'm willing to pursue it. The bill's being laid over, and also to address Lead Legally concerns about the Department of Human Rights capacity to do their job with whatever language this ends up being in its final form is something that I'm also very legitimately interested in pursuing. So thank you.
Thank you, Vice President. Thank you for a lively discussion. I think we can have, to be honest. So thank you for, and thank you for the discussion.